Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to class number 3, lecture number 3. This lecture is the second part of the fictional and procedural space theme that we're starting our part of the spatial practices course with. My name is Peter Nelson for those of you who haven't met me already. Okay, so just to remind some of the people who might have just joined the class this week, the way that we learn this semester is we have a series of pre-recorded lectures that I will make for you like this. I'll make them before class and I'll email them out to you before class. And I want you to watch them before class so that we can use our time together to discuss ideas and to work on our projects rather than me talk to you like this in real time. I think it's better that you watch these lectures in your own time and then we will discuss the content together. I also make pre-recorded tutorials for you. So the point here is that because we're using software, we're using Blender, I want you to be able to learn at your own pace. Sometimes exercises require you to, go back and forth a lot, work out what you did wrong and so on. And so I prefer that you do that in your own time so that we can all learn at the same speed and then we can use our time together to solve the problems that you encounter along the way. And I think this will kind of help us learn a bit faster. And then when we're together for our live sessions, we will use a combination of Zoom, Blender for troubleshooting, and then on Google Docs we will do group exercises, and sometimes group exercises also on virtual whiteboards using Miro. And during the class for this week, the live class, I want to have another show and tell. I want to see what you did for your first Blender animation, for those of you who are still working on that. And of course, I want to see your work from the first 3D modeling and procedural modeling task, the apartment building. Like last week, I want to make a list of the problems you encountered. Which bits were really difficult? Did you solve the problems yourself? Or do you still have some problems that you'd like my help with? And that's what these live discussions are very, very good for. We will work in Google Docs. And then we will also have a discussion on this lecture. I'd like to have a discussion on what you think of the story. I encourage you to not only watch the lecture, but the story that the lecture talks about. The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges, or simply The Library, is uploaded onto our class Moodle and our Google Drive. So it's there if you'd like to read it. It's not a very long story. So I'd like to discuss that. And I'd also like to continue to collect some more images, look at images that have repetition, but also how we can start to think of repetition and procedural space as like a creative tool, and maybe something that can help give you some ideas for what type of project you'd like to make for the Spatial Practices course. And of course, as you work, I'd love you to put some of these images and your ideas up on your Wix page so we can have a look at what sort of inspiration you are starting to attach to and what might help inspire your final project. And at the end of class, I will introduce another exercise for Blender for those of you who are ready for it. Okay, so this week, the topic of this lecture is Fictional and Procedural Space Part 2. As I promised last week, we're going to look at a second story. This time it's also about the Tower of Babel myth, but it's by a different author, Jorge Luis Borges. But again, the themes in this story are really useful and really appropriate for what I'd like us to do in 3D graphics and 3D animation. Okay, so the author of the story for this week is Jorge Luis Borges, who was a philosopher and a writer from Argentina. And he's best known for the short stories he published in the 1940s. Many of the ideas and quotes I use in this lecture come from the introduction that's written by Maria Kodama for this book here, which is called Jorge Luis Borges on Mysticism, which is a collection of his short stories that are to do with spatial topics and sort of mystical topics. Okay, so let's get started with some of the ideas that Borges writes about. Here's a great quote from the story The Maker from 1950. So Borges writes, A man sets out to draw the world. As the years go by, he peoples a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, fish, rooms, instruments, starts, horses, and individuals. A short time before he dies, he discovers that the patient labyrinth of lines, in fact, simply traces the lineaments of his own face. Let's move on. If we think back to our discussion about the Tower of Babel myth last week via Ted Chiang's Tower of Babylon, what we find in the work of Borges is a similar spatial and procedural logic. In Ted Chiang's story, at the top of this seemingly infinite tower, it didn't actually bring the builders to God, it simply returned them back to where they started. For Borges, in his story The Maker, an image of the world is an image of a kind of impossibly complex reality, but once this complex reality is finished, the artist simply finds that they have made a portrait of themselves. So much like Ted Chiang's use of spatial logic, where we start and finish, we go through infinity and we somehow end up back where we started, there's a similar type of logic in many of the works of Borges. Here's another quote from the story The Aleph. In 1949, Borges writes, "I saw the Aleph from everywhere at once. I saw the earth in the Aleph. I saw my face and my viscera. I saw your face, and I felt dizzy, and I wept, because my eyes had seen that secret, hypothetical object whose name has been usurped by men, but which no man has ever truly looked upon, the inconceivable universe." So in the story The Aleph, Borges is describing something like a spatial singularity, maybe almost like a black hole, something that contains all of the universe inside it, visible from every angle, as if it has more than the regular 3 dimensions. Much like in The Maker, we can see that Borges has this really special fascination with spaces that are very complex and spaces that seem to repeat themselves, much like the infinite GIF I've got here of Keanu Reeves, or this GIF here of the Tesseract 4-dimensional cube. And for us as artists, using our spatial imagination, we can use computer graphics to think about lots of spaces that repeat themselves. And also, spaces that repeat themselves are very, very common in a lot of popular entertainment. Consider the strange type of spaces you have in computer games, where you can walk in one direction and suddenly end up popping out back where you started, or when one door upstairs takes you back to a door downstairs. Or like on the left-hand side here, we have the infinite falling GIF that is sort of animated on top of MC Escher's staircase, which is based on the Penrose staircase, which you can also look up, and maybe I'll put a link in the description. Some sort of very interesting distortions of space that we will talk about a little bit later in the course when we look at parallel spaces. The similarity between the spatial imagination of Borges and early computer games is also explored really brilliantly by this lecture by Professor Marcus du Sautoy in his lecture at Gresham College from 2015. In this lecture, Sautoy explains that if we had a 2-dimensional world rather than the 3-dimensional world that we live in, maybe like a top-down computer game like Asteroids, a 2-dimensional world can be turned into an infinite world by wrapping it onto a 3-dimensional shape. In his example, he uses the shape of a torus or a donut shape. The result being that the left and right axis of the shape are connected together, and the up and down axis of the shape are also connected together, giving us the infinite 2-dimensional space within the finite 3-dimensional space. For those of you who are interested, I made a Blender tutorial last semester for 3D modeling the Library of Babel by Borges, which was inspired by Marcus du Sautoy's lecture. But this semester, I'm going to focus our attention on lighting and rendering first. But if you're interested in learning how to make this image that's on the screen now, I will put the link to that YouTube video in the description of this lecture if you'd like to try it out. Okay, so on to the story that I want to tell you for this week, which is Borges's Library of Babel, or often just called the Library. So much like Ted Chiang's Tower of Babylon from last week, Borges is basing his story on the biblical myth of the Tower of Babylon, and he's doing this to ask mathematical questions about the limits of human knowledge and the relationship between language, mathematical probability, and I also believe time. Much like last week, I think these stories are a really wonderful way for us to think about procedural space, spaces that are based on rules and repetition, and how space itself can become a metaphor for some wonderful intellectual and artistic problems. The proposition, or the idea behind Borges's Library of Babel is this. What if there was a library, and inside this library was every single possible combination of letters and punctuation marks, so 25 characters of the Latin alphabet, which would be the letters, the full stop, the comma, and the space. And then every book in the library has 410 pages with 40 lines on each page. The library would contain every book that could ever be written, that has ever been written, that will ever be written. It will have every single spelling mistake. It will have every single book of possible nonsense, of just a jumble of letters that could ever be written. It would contain the complete history of the future, as well as the complete history of every incorrect future, every future that never happens. It would include your life story, as well as your life story that never happens. Just as one true version of the library will be there, with every single possible mistake that will also be there. In order for this library to exist, it would take up more space than the entire size of the universe. What we have here is, if you think about it, a procedural story. We simply take the number of letters in the alphabet, we multiply them by the lines on the page and the pages in the book, and we try to predict every possible sentence and therefore every possible idea that could ever be thought. And the theme of this book was actually developed by the German philosopher Kurt Laswitz in 1901 in his story, The Universal Library. And Borges describes, in his work, he describes the library arranged in these kind of endless hexagonal chambers, sort of like a giant four-dimensional beehive. Maybe something like a sphere where the center of the library is also every other point. It's a little bit of a complex idea, these sort of infinite four-dimensional spaces, and we're going to explore that a little bit in the coming weeks. But what I want you to think about here is this sort of infinite repeating space, again, is very, very similar to that sort of infinite linear tower that Ted Chiang described last week, that somehow the tower is an impossibly tall structure, but the top of the tower and the bottom of the tower are somehow in the same place, almost like a line that is turned into a circle. And here we can sort of see how literature is being used as an intellectual spatial exercise. In her introduction to Borges and mysticism, Maria Kodama explores how Borges combines mathematics, the science of probability and philosophy, with religious studies in his own efforts to understand existence and the pursuit of the mystical experience. When we think of the mystical experience, we might think of the experience of the infinite or the sublime. When connecting Borges's library to the title of the book, Kodama points once again to the Bible and the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, we have the sentence, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelled among us." And so according to Kodama, Borges looks at this and he interprets word to literally mean everything. And Borges is experimenting with this idea in the Library of Babel, and how language and our understanding of knowledge and time is somehow connected to words. If we have a book that can have every possible event that can ever and will ever happen, something strange is going on between words, experience, and time. Kodama writes, Borges refers to the desperation he feels as a writer facing the impossibility of using words to describe simultaneously that his eyes see, because the word is successive, but because man is made of time and time is humanly successive. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. We experience language through time. When we hear words, the words exist in sentences. And when we hear stories, they occur in the order in which the story is told to us. But on the other hand, in the case of Borges's library, every story already exists somewhere in the library. Even if nobody has read the book, every story is there. So that also means that your entire life somewhere is written down in the library. So therefore, it asks the question, are we living our life based on a series of choices that we make in the moment? Or are we simply living out what is already written down in one of these books? The problem being we just don't know which book it's written in. And Borges compares the experience of reading a text to an experience of living in the world. If the library exists as a finite number of books that can be read, does that mean that all human lives exist as simply a finite combination of experiences that can be had? And this is kind of why Borges plays these games with numbers and words. To show you what I mean, there's actually a great computer program that takes the rules that Borges has in his story and makes them accessible in the web browser. So if we go to this website, libraryofbabel.info, type exactly what you did today into the computational Borges library, and you will find the page of the book in which what you did today already exists. And then type any thought that comes into your head. These thoughts will exist on a page in the book as well. And the page will have a page number and a book number. You can copy the news from yesterday into the library, and somewhere on one page of the library books will be exactly what happened yesterday in the Library of Babel. So now we can start to see why Borges had this obsession with comparing the idea of the word to the idea of everything, or infinite possibility. The idea of space and time and infinite combinations are a very popular theme in contemporary culture. A wonderful example of this is Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar, where after going through the event horizon of the black hole, the main character finds himself trapped inside an infinite library, very reminiscent of the Library of Babel. In this case, the library represents time, but displayed in a kind of three-dimensional space, and displayed as a series of bookshelves. And every bookshelf is the bookshelf from the original home of the protagonist, but unfolded over time. So it's the infinite bookshelf where space and time are connected together into this strange kind of fractal space. And in the Library of Babel, even though we're talking about language, we can sort of see how simple multiplications of letters and sentences return us to some wonderful questions about our experience of thought and time. For Borges, the invention of a medium of writing implies the invention of everything that could ever be thought, or every event that could ever happen, which is a pretty incredible, maybe somewhat scary idea. But now I want you to think about how repetition, duplication, multiplication, how these things, if we're working by hand as artists, repetition can take us a long time and be impossible. But when we're working with computers, this is what computers do very, very well, is this idea of repetition. I'll see if I can get these videos to repeat. Okay. So as we're moving through Blender and our spatial thinking, what I'd like you to do is to remind yourself that we're working with a very interesting medium where it's not so much like painting or drawing, where every object, every mark is somehow connected to the time and the possibilities we have to make these marks. Instead, we're working with a medium that really specializes in repetition. And so these stories about towers that grow forever or words made of every combination, this procedural way of thinking is very, very close to what makes computer graphics such a special medium for artists. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture for today. Hopefully that was a nice short one for you. So that's the second story that we have looked at that talks about fictional and procedural space. And during class this week, I want us to think a little bit more about how we can use repetition, multiplication, and duplication as a creative tool. Okay, that's it. I'll see you all in class, and I look forward to seeing the works that you've created. Okay, bye-bye.